Israel today stands over the corpse of the two-state solution, with the idea of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank reduced to a distant memory. For all intents and purposes, Israel has annexed the West Bank, leaving no semblance of an independent Palestinian state. This conquest was achieved through a settler-state axis, where the government created a legal framework to enable large-scale settlement expansion, while settlers advanced on the ground, methodically encircling and fragmenting Palestinian areas. The creation of a legal system that enabled settlers to dispossess Palestinians has resulted in increasing lawlessness. Settlers have grown more aggressive in their efforts, even attacking Israeli officials and the IDF when they stand in their way. Meanwhile, radical settlers now hold prominent positions in Israeli society as politicians, soldiers, and generals, pushing the nation further to the extreme right. Extreme cases of settler violence have caused even Israel's staunchest Western allies, who often overlook its indiscretions, to impose sanctions, leading to Israel's growing isolation on the world stage. In this video, we'll explore the history of West Bank settlements, how they began as a fringe movement, and how the settler-state axis transformed them into a dominant force in Israeli politics, and in the process slowly radicalized Israeli society. With its overwhelming victory in the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel more than doubled the amount of land it controlled, seizing new territory in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. The Geneva Conventions, to which Israel was a signatory, prohibit occupying powers from transferring their own civilian populations into occupied territory. Yet, a complex web of strategic, security, religious, and ideological motivations made Israel reluctant to relinquish control. From a military perspective, an independent West Bank posed a grave threat. Its elevated terrain overlooked Israel's major population centers, granting any hostile force a significant strategic advantage. The establishment of an autonomous Palestinian state in the West Bank was seen as a nightmare scenario for Israeli defense planners. Meanwhile, for religious Zionists, the West Bank was Judea and Samaria, the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. The first settlement, however, was more practical than it was ideological or strategic. It began in April 1975 at Ein Yabrud, an abandoned Jordanian military base near Ofra in the West Bank. Workers initially commuted to rebuild the base but soon stayed overnight, laying the groundwork for a Jewish foothold in the area. This initiative was quietly supported by Defense Minister Shimon Peres, who labeled it a work camp, not a settlement to sidestep legal objections. By 1977, successive Labour governments had established nearly 30 settlements in sparsely populated parts of the West Bank, often repurposing army outposts for civilian use. The settler movement accelerated under Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who came to power with the Likud party in 1977 and increased settlement construction in the West Bank with the aim of preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. Ariel Sharon, who was serving as agriculture minister and would later become Israel's 11th prime minister, proposed settling 2 million Jewish Israelis in the West Bank, describing it as a security belt to solidify Israel's control on the region. The legal basis for these settlements was crafted by Plea Albeck, a relatively unknown bureaucrat in the Israeli Justice Ministry. She uncovered the Ottoman Land Code of 1858, a law from the era when Palestine was under Ottoman rule. The regulation allowed land that remained uncultivated and unregistered for at least 3 consecutive years to be claimed by the state. The Likud government adapted this law, designating Israel as the administering power and using it to justify seizing West Bank land. Flying over the West Bank in army helicopters, Albeck identified plots of land that met the criteria of the Ottoman Land Code. Her legal interpretations paved the way for the establishment of over 100 Jewish settlements, which she affectionately referred to as "my children," a term that earned her the nickname the mother of all settlements. Israeli courts frequently ruled against Palestinian land and property claims, as many Palestinians struggled to provide complete ownership documentation, often relying on incomplete records from the Ottoman period. Thus, Israel simply needed to delay, until the land remained unregistered or uncultivated for 3 years, at which point it could legally be transferred to the Israeli government. Much of this land was then allocated for settlements or military use. Between 1981 and 2018, Israel designated roughly a quarter of the West Bank as state land, with the majority assigned to Israeli settlements. Settlement growth continued into the 1990s until Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin pledged a settlement freeze during negotiations for the Oslo Accords. Rabin's Labour government in 1992 was the first and so far the only administration to take steps toward limiting settlement expansion. Although the Oslo Accords did not explicitly ban new settlements, they initiated a process widely seen as a pathway to a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Accords divided the West Bank into 3 zones. Area A, encompassing Palestinian urban centers, was placed under full administrative and security control of the PA. Area B, including Palestinian towns and villages, was administered by the PA but under Israeli security control. Area C, encompassing 60% of the West Bank, remained entirely under Israeli control and was home to a growing network of settlements. To many on the Israeli right, the Accords represented a dangerous step toward an independent Palestinian state. Opposition to the Accords turned violent, culminating in a Jewish terrorist attack at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. Early on February 25, 1994, Baruch Goldstein, dressed in an IDF uniform, entered the Cave of the Patriarchs, a shared place of worship for Jews and Muslims, and opened fire on Muslim worshippers. During the holy month of Ramadan, the mosque was crowded with hundreds of Muslim worshippers. Goldstein shot 108 rounds before being subdued and beaten to death. The massacre claimed 29 lives and injured over 100 people. The attack reflected rising radicalization among some settlers and right-wing factions, which Israel's internal security agency, the Shin Bet, had repeatedly warned about. Rabbis and politicians openly called for violence against Israeli officials supporting the peace process, with some issuing religious rulings justifying Rabin's assassination. These warnings went unheeded, and on November 4, 1995, Yigal Amir, a law student radicalized by opposition to the Oslo Accords, assassinated Rabin in Tel Aviv after a peace rally. Much to the right-wing's surprise, the Oslo Accords enabled Israel to tighten its grip on the West Bank. The Oslo Accords offered Palestinians no clear path to independence, leaving borders undefined and sovereignty unattained. Instead, the PA was granted limited self-governance in isolated pockets of the West Bank, while Israel retained overarching control over security, critical resources like water and energy, and external borders. Area C was intended to be transferred to the Palestinian Authority through negotiations and a final agreement. However, the outbreak of the Second Intifada allowed Israel to indefinitely postpone the process, using the delay to expand settlements across the area where it maintained full control. Settlements have expanded under every Israeli prime minister since Oslo, driven by a settler-state axis in which Israeli policy works hand in hand with settlers to ensure the eventual annexation of the West Bank. Since Oslo, Israel has employed various bureaucratic methods alongside violent settlers to consolidate complete control over the West Bank. One popular tool has been the control of building permits in Area C. Between 2017 and 2021, the Israeli Defense Ministry approved just 33 building permits for Palestinians. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of permits are approved for settlers each year. Denied permits, many Palestinians build without authorization, leaving their homes at risk of demolition by the Israeli army, which views preventing Palestinian construction as part of its mandate in controlling Area C. Additionally, the state actively encourages Jewish migration to the West Bank through a range of financial incentives. These include generous housing subsidies, low-interest mortgages, flexible repayment plans, and tax relief. These financial benefits are complemented by well-funded schools, hospitals, and community centers, offering settlers a high standard of living at a lower cost, often within a short commute to major cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. While many settlers moved to the West Bank for the improved quality of life, ideological settlers have become increasingly violent, aiming to forcibly displace Palestinians. They use the dual legal systems in the West Bank, which provide them with significant advantages. Palestinian civilians in Israeli-controlled parts of the West Bank are subject to military law, which grants the IDF and Shin Bet considerable authority. They can hold suspects for extended periods without trial or access to either a lawyer or the evidence against them. They can wiretap, conduct secret surveillance, hack into databases, and gather intelligence on any Arab living in the occupied territory with few restrictions. All West Bank settlers are in theory subject to the same military law that applies to Palestinian residents, but in practice, they are treated according to the civil law of the State of Israel. Shin Bet often investigates similar acts of terrorism by Jewish settlers and Palestinians using entirely different methods. The job of investigating Jewish terrorism falls to a division of Shin Bet called the Department for Counterintelligence and Prevention of Subversion in the Jewish sector, known more commonly as the Jewish Department. It is dwarfed both in size, prestige, and funding by Shin Bet's Arab Department, the division charged with combating Palestinian terrorism. Particularly, but not only among troops drawn from the settlements, there is increasing tolerance and even open support for settler violence. Settler violence includes everything from trespassing and blocking roads or access to land and water sources, setting cars, homes, or other property on fire, stealing or harming livestock, burning or cutting down olive trees, throwing stones at Palestinian cars, vandalizing churches and mosques, and firing at civilians. The army's posture vis-à-vis the Palestinian population has evolved from tolerating settler violence to at times becoming openly complicit. In 2015, the Israeli human rights organization Yesh Din published a report detailing how soldiers passively witnessed attacks by Israeli citizens on Palestinians and their property, refrained from detaining offenders, neglected to secure the scene for purposes of collecting evidence, and failed to report incidents to the police. Another reason why settler violence has continued unabated is that growing numbers of IDF soldiers live in West Bank settlements. Soldiers from such backgrounds are less likely to confront settlers. Settlers operate with near-complete impunity, receiving only occasional public condemnation, and a growing number of Israelis support them even in the most extreme cases of violence. One example is the Duma arson attack, where an 18-month-old Palestinian boy was burned to death after settlers firebombed his family's home. The attack made international headlines and was officially condemned by the Israeli government, but no meaningful action was taken to rein in settler violence. Instead, much of the Israeli right rallied around the perpetrators, with settlers taunting the victim's family outside courtrooms. A wedding video showing guests stabbing a photo of the toddler went viral, and a campaign to free one of the attackers raised over $300,000. Despite these incidents, the vast majority of complaints against settlers failed to result in indictments. Since Benjamin Netanyahu's formation of Israel's most right-wing coalition in 2022, settler violence has increased, driven further by the aftermath of the October 7th attack. The formation of Netanyahu's far-right coalition at the end of 2022 catapulted the settler movement into the national spotlight, giving a boost both to settlement expansion and violence. The right-wing coalition includes Bezalel Smotrich and Ben Gvir, two far-right politicians and settlers who openly advocate for the annexation of the West Bank. Smotrich has a history of racist incitement, calling for the segregation of Arabs and Jews in hospital maternity wards and supporting a shoot-to-kill policy against Palestinian stone throwers, including children. In 2005, he was detained by Shin Bet on suspicion of plotting to blow up the Ayalon highway and was reportedly found in possession of 700 liters of gasoline. Meanwhile, Ben Gvir was barred as a teenager from serving in the Israeli army because he was considered too extremist and has been convicted 8 times for a range of offenses from incitement to racism to support for Catch, a party outlawed in 1988 for being a Jewish terrorist organization. Such was Ben Gvir's reputation that Netanyahu had previously refused to share a stage with him. Netanyahu's government will collapse without support from both Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and the October 7th attack has seen a surge in support for both men. Smotrich's critics and admirers agree that he is an unusually effective bureaucrat. As both Israel's finance minister and a minister within the defense ministry, he has accelerated the pace of settlements in the West Bank. He has replaced military institutions that have long overseen Israel's occupation in the West Bank with the newly established Settlements Administration. Settlements Administration was formed with broad powers, including the authority to expropriate Palestinian land, to approve housing construction in settlements, to condemn Palestinian construction as illegal, and to retroactively authorize settlements that were built without government approval, popularly known as outposts. As a civilian body, the Settlements Administration's job is to promote the interests of Israeli citizens, which means the settlers. And the chief interest of the settlers is speeding up the pace of building and expanding settlements. More than that, the transfer of authority from the military to civilians amounts to a quiet and creeping de facto annexation. Smotrich recently celebrated his latest achievement, the creation of a new settlement, Nahal Heletz, designed to link a major West Bank settlement bloc with Jerusalem. The move is part of a strategy by Israeli settlers to encircle Palestinian cities and towns with settlements, cutting them off from one another and paving the way for future control over these isolated enclaves. Meanwhile, Itamar Ben Gvir has taken a lenient approach towards settler violence in the occupied West Bank, purchased 10,000 rifles to distribute to Israeli residents in mixed Jewish-Arab cities and West Bank settlements, as well as repeatedly threatened to build a synagogue on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. His inner circle is equally extreme, with his chief of staff, Hanamel Dorfman, filmed at his wedding dancing with knives and mimicking the stabbing of Palestinians. His close advisor, Benzi Goldstein, leads Lehava, a group that actively opposes Jewish-Arab relationships and marriages. Both Smotrich and Ben Gvir have advocated for the resettlement of the Gaza Strip and effectively given West Bank settlers free rein. When two settlers were killed by a Palestinian gunman, settlers responded by going on a violent rampage through the village of Hawara, torching cars, buildings and trees, while IDF soldiers largely stood by. Smotrich later tweeted that the village of Hawara should be wiped out, drawing international condemnation. Emboldened by the war and the far-right ministers, settlers have also directed their anger toward the IDF. In one instance, Jewish settlers attacked senior military officers, including Major General Avi Bluth, head of the Army's Central Command in the West Bank, after he promised to crack down on settler violence. Meanwhile, far-right protesters stormed an army base in support of Israeli soldiers detained for allegedly sexually abusing Palestinian prisoners. This surge of settler power, driven by the far-right coalition, has not only succeeded in blocking the creation of a Palestinian state, but has also exposed the fragility of Israel's institutions, which are now struggling to contain a movement they once nurtured but can no longer control. The settler-state axis has largely succeeded in preventing the emergence of an independent Palestinian state. Today, Palestinians in the West Bank are confined to fragmented towns and cities, surrounded by a growing network of Israeli settlements. Gaza lies in ruins, devastated by more than a year of war. What began as a fringe movement has gradually taken root across all levels of Israeli society. Settlers are now soldiers, politicians, and judges, shaping the state's institutions and pushing its policies further to the right. This radical shift has come at a steep cost. Israel's global reputation is in tatters, with international courts investigating allegations of war crimes and genocide. European nations are escalating sanctions, while support among young Americans has plummeted to an all-time low. In a world increasingly defined by multipolar power dynamics, relying solely on American backing may no longer be enough. Can Israel recover its international reputation, or is it destined to remain on the path to becoming a pariah state? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. I've been your host, Albert. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time.